Grüß, willkommen in einer Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 4 of my Wargaming Rules Review series of videos. In this video I'll be providing an overview of the P17CW rules, which is a figure game version of the SPI Pre-Stags board game. In this video I'm providing an overview of my figure game conversion of the SPI Pre-Stags board game. As the basic game system is similar, and this has been described in my previous video, I'll investigate the basic steps for converting any board game into a figure gaming format, followed by investigating the conversion of SPI Pre-Stag board game into a figure gaming format, plus providing some of the changes that I've implemented compared with the original board game. For a quick recap of what Pre-Stags is, Pre-Stags means pre-17th century tactical game system. I must admit I did not understand what Pre-Stags originally meant, as the acronym is not what I consider a particularly good one. It should be pre-SCCTGS or something of that nature, but as you cannot easily say that, I suppose it was changed to Pre-Stags to allow gamers to say it. This game system took a number of earlier games, Armageddon, Phalanx, Centurion, Dark Ages and Renaissance of Infantry, and standardized all the games so they used the same basic game system. This allowed players to pit an ancient Egyptian force mix against Gustav Adolphus. I'm only looking at the first three periods shown here. These are Chariot, Spartan and Legion. That is, I'm only looking at them in detail. The result of my conversion efforts was P17CW, which is a totally rewritten figure game conversion of the SPI Pre-Stag board game. It plays, for all extents and purposes, identically to the original SPI Pre-Stags. The main difference is these rules use DBMM troop types and army lists, as well as a card-based scenario generation system. This video covers the process I undertook to convert the rules. When converting a board game, you need to start with the unit. What does a unit represent in terms of figures and combat strength? For Pre-Stag, each unit would typically represent an element of figures, but in other games, each element could be represented by a strength point or a number of strength points. A board game, like the SPI Napoleonic War, would use the strength point system for a couple of reasons. The unit strengths vary, so unless you want to keep track of the different formations, unit by unit, you cannot represent each unit with a single element. The unit types are minimal. There are basically only three troop types: infantry, cavalry and artillery. Light infantry and cavalry move slightly faster, so you need to consider these two additional types, and finally horse artillery also moves faster, totaling 6 unit types. This can easily be represented using standard Napoleonic figures. For example, an element could be represented by 2 strength points, thus an 8-4 unit is represented by 4 elements all grouped together. Other SPI games covering the American Civil War could also be based on strength points. Incidentally, this is only one way of addressing the conversion process. In the end, I didn't go down this particular path, but it's certainly something that players could consider if they're converting their other favourite board game into a figure gaming format. On the other hand, with a set of rules such as modern battles, the best strategy is each unit represents a single element. This is because all similar unit types have the same combat and movement values. Thus, you could represent a Syrian infantry brigade with a single BTR-60 element, knowing all such figures would possess the same combat and movement values. The combat values are not simple, as there is a separate attack and defense value, and some units have a barrage and FPF value for artillery. We also see the ratios are very different, with infantry having different values to the armour. These forces players to assign unique values for a specific figure, requiring players to cross-reference these values which obviously requires a cheat sheet. In this example, a player would assign specific values for each unit: BTR-60s for infantry brigades, T-55s for tank brigades, etc. With Pre-Stag, all unit types have the same value. All militia spearmen, or MI, have a melee strength of 3 and a movement allowance of 3. Thus, a player could use a single type of spearman element to represent this unit. This shows a PP unit, or professional pikeman unit, and it would be represented by an element of pike, or Macedonian phalangites, or something along the same lines. Each time the element of phalangites needed to move, it would use the value of 4 movement points, and each time it needed to engage in melee, it would use the combat strength of 6 combat strength points. One factor you need to consider, particularly with pre-stags, is stacking. In pre-stags, stacking can range from 1 unit to 4 units. In a figure game, it's not possible to stack elements on top of each other. Instead, you place the element behind each other in full front-rear edge contact with the element to its front or rear. While 4 elements will result in a rather long unit or deep units, it's generally feasible and I found no issues doing this. Any more than this and it may become an issue based on the game system. In the end, I decided to standardise on 3 because I use movement trays, but players can go with the original stacking values in pre-stag if they so desire. The troop types in pre-stag does not align with many figure gaming rules such as DBMM. In pre-stags, the most powerful infantry is the professional pikeman. The next is the professional spearman, which would represent most, if not all, of the hoplites. The militia infantry would represent low morale, poorly trained and equipped infantry. The light troop unit represents close order troops with no armour and minimal shields. Skirmish units would be slingers, for example, but probably represent any open order troop type. Bowman units could represent open order, or even close order bowmen. Heavy cavalry would be cavalry which has some level of armour, possibly on the horse or the infantryman or cavalryman sitting on top of the horse. Medium cavalry would represent the bulk of the shock cavalry arm of any army. Light cavalry would represent unarmoured javelin-armed cavalry for the most part. Oriental cavalry, which is a rather unusual troop type, possesses a bow but could also engage in melee. Elephants are pretty much self-explanatory. They're big grey beasts. Leaders would be represented by a typical leader element from any particular set of rules. I would personally wish to modify these troop types to align with a set of rules such as DBMM, which would be a trivial exercise. However, for my initial version of the rules, I'm copying the original rules faithfully and will reserve additional troop types for the next version of the rules, which I'll describe at the end of this video. Next area to consider is the playing area. As whatever unit system you use, the width of a hex has to accommodate the unit. Thus, it must be a minimum of the element's width. If using 4 cm wide elements, this map would be a number of hex multiplied by 4 cm. The north-south axis has 37 hexes, so the playing area would be 148 centimetres, or between around about 4.5 feet. The height would be 116 centimetres, or about, let's say, 3 3/4 feet. You could reduce this down to a standard 3 foot by 4 foot playing area, but cutting out some of the edges. But a starting size of 3 by 4 feet is quite reasonable for these rules. While I personally don't use hexes, if you decided to use hexes, then the playing area will be much larger than what I've just described, as each hex needs to accommodate the maximum depth of a unit as well, which could be 8 centimetres. However, for the most part, I use a hexless version or hexless conversion of the rules. As a result, if you decide to go for a hexless version of the rules, then 3 by 4 feet is extremely viable. This playing area is probably not one I would use for ancients. It's actually basically the map of Leipzig for a Napoleonic game, but I think you probably get the idea. This nonetheless is about 3 by 4 feet. I've previously done a number of videos on the mechanics of creating a hexless conversion of a board game in a figure gaming format, so I'm not going to really cover that in any particular detail in this video, but in simple terms, hexes are represented with base widths. So thus, a movement allowance of 4 means 4 base widths, or 16 centimetres if using 4 centimetre wide bases. A zone of control simply extends in all directions from the unit or elements, most likely half a base width for movement purposes and 1 base width for combat purposes, assuming that you have a mandatory combat system. Apart from these general special rules, that's all you really need if you wish to avoid hexes. The rules can effectively be identical otherwise to the original board game. My initial attempt of converting this board game into a figure gaming format basically copied the original board game with no changes to the game system, only the minimal required to use figures and of course to avoid the use of hexes. During this conversion, one aspect of pre-stag which did interest me was, the playing area. So let's drill down into that in a little bit more detail. This shows a simplified playing area for the Chariot game, with the hexes obviously removed. I used this as my template for creating the playing area, and each square is a 1 foot square that you can see here. The playing area is covered with letters, which are used for each of the scenarios, deployment, etc. Basically, this playing area allows you to refight a dozen different battles, using different letters to indicate deployment areas and objectives. Let's look at an example, in this case the Battle of Kadesh, with the Hittites arriving from the north edge, which is the top edge, and the Egyptians deployed in location E and location A. This scenario uses the entire playing area, as most of the battle consisted of pre-battle manoeuvring. Many other scenarios would only use a much smaller part of the playing area. Let's look at another example, in this case the Battle of Qaqorgha 854 BC, which only involves half the playing area. One issue with creating historical battles is the customization of the playing area, especially roads and rivers. While not really an issue in the period 3000 BC to 500 BC, as we know so little about the terrain of battles, it becomes, who cares where the roads, etc. are. However, it becomes more of an issue in the later period where we know a bit more about the battlefield. This system allows a player to create a single playing area which can accommodate a wide range of different battles and is reasonably clever. Some terrain pieces such as hills, built-up areas, woods, swamps and lakes can be made as separate terrain pieces. Rivers and roads are always my main issue, as I have no good river or road solution apart from embedding it in the playing area. Let's swing over to a later version of pre-stags, or the Spartan game to be specific. This is a much more busy playing area as we have more knowledge of specific terrain in various battles, thus they all need to be included. In a figure gaming playing area, most of the terrain pieces can be made as separate pieces, which can be either placed in the playing area or not. So it becomes a lesser of an issue than, let's say, a board game. But the basic concept of having a standard playing area which can be used for a host of battles is a rather good idea. The problem is, of course, getting the detail correct. Let's look at a specific battle, in this case the Battle of Marathon. This does not use much of the playing area, in this case only a 1 foot by 2 foot segment, as behind the Persians there is only water. The Q position is the Persian position, and the Athenians deploy anywhere between the line that runs between H and L. Some of the battles require some pre-battle manoeuvring, as we can see with the Battle of Corinth playing area. One benefit of this scale is we can have pre-battle manoeuvring, which is something most traditional figure gaming rules completely lack. Some battles require no terrain, such as Arabella 331 BC. Surprisingly, this scenario works very well, mainly due to the command rules and the fact Darius did not move at all until threatened and then basically ran away. The other interesting aspect of the scenarios in pre-stags is the victory conditions, which has a basic set of victory conditions based on losses and then a special set of conditions which normally require controlling objectives. This shows the playing area for Uscium 273 BC. The objective idea is interesting, and it often forces one side to attack, as they need to obtain a specific objective to win. The standard loss-based conditions tend to encourage players to do nothing, as the quickest way to lose is to suffer losses. But when you also need to achieve special or specific objectives, that desire to stay safe is thrown out the window and players have to do something. Objectives are a good way to simulate orders without the confusion and hassle of actually having order rules. While I have to admit this example I'm about to talk about is not a particularly good scenario or historical scenario, a good example of what I'm just talking about is the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC. In this case, the Romans need to take the objective Q in order to win, which gives them the incentive to attack. Without this incentive, there's little reason for the Romans to attack, as they know they risk destruction if they make an error. But an objective-based victory condition system forces the Romans to move or risk defeat due to inaction. One point I do wish to raise about changing the board game rules. I strongly advise not changing the actual board game rules unless absolutely necessary to accommodate figures and a hexless playing area. Every time I've done this, it's been a disaster. An example is facing. This sounds like a logical rule to add for figure gaming, but when I used this for Napoleonics or World War II board gaming, which did not use facing, it was a disaster. Game systems are typically holistic, and a basic change can often cause major issues elsewhere, so change at your own risk. Pre-Stags does have optional facing rules, which can certainly be used as part of the original game system, which is what I do. The rules which players can consider is optional rules to give the game more flavour. Examples could be replacing the pre-stag unit types with DBMM unit types, which is what I do now by default. These types of rules are good, but as long as they're optional or they're well thought out. In my second version of the board game conversion, which I call P17CW version 2, I decided to address some of the issues with the board game that I saw after playing quite a few test games. Possibly the most annoying aspect was the troop type, which I personally feel is overly simplistic. The second issue was allowing these rules to accommodate ad hoc points-based games, which is a staple of the ancient gaming world, and I needed to be able to do this if I was ever going to attract other ancient gamers to these rules. In order to solve both issues, I decided to adopt the DBMM troop types, point systems and army lists exactly as they're printed in the army lists and DBMM rules book. Let's drill down a little bit into the troop types. Using the points values for each DBMM troop type, I converted that into a P17CW combat strength and movement rate. The original pre-stags gives me a good guide, while as being simplistic, most of the troop types that I need to cover are actually included there. This shows the combat values of Blade from superior, ordinary, fast, inferior and extraordinary. There is a game system difference between regular and irregular, which is not obvious with these rules or with these values, but does exist in the rules. Then I use the standard DBMM army list to build up force mixes. I typically use 200 points and 400 point force mixes, although I do also give 300 points a go occasionally. The high cost of generals does have an unusual impact to force mixes, so I may increase my 200 point force mix, standard force mixes up to possibly 240 points. I need to conduct more playtesting to confirm, but what you see here is DBMM force mixes. These could be used for a standard DBMM game if you so desire. The approach of this, or the benefits of this approach is obvious. Anyone with a DBMM army list and a DBMM force mix can construct a force mix for a game of P17CW. It means I do not need to worry about army lists and point systems. Of course, the typical DBMM player would likely not be interested in a set of rules such as P17CWs, as those players tend to be more interested in tactical detail, but a new player could start with P17CW and then move up to DBMM with minimal effort. Let's now look at how to obtain the rules. These are homegrown rules and they can be downloaded from the shown IO group site here. You can also download the original pre-stag SPI rules and do your own conversion if you so desire. Or even if you put hexes onto your playing area, just play the games or rules as are, using figures instead of counters. It works reasonably well, and that's how I started doing this conversion. And so we come to an end of episode 4, my video series on rules review, in this case providing players some useful guidelines which they can use to convert board gaming into a figure gaming format, as well as providing a brief overview of P17CW. If you need to know the actual game system of P17CW or pre-stags, look at my previous video on pre-stags. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.